or the new service development process literature looks like. And then, having set down the literature, I want to sort of give you some examples of how I think that's missing the point in many ways, or it needs to be supplemented in quite a major way, and then show how, and it's supplemented through, for example, trying to embrace serendipity, social networks, luck. And then I want to move on to say, well, how can we embrace that? What can the organisation do in terms of structure, architecture to do that, given that you can't force luck, you can't force social networks, but you can nurture it and encourage it. A lot of the literature on new product development or new service development has focused on trying to work out what the set of stages should be for the innovation process. It doesn't really matter what the different stages are, and different books will give you different panaceas about this. But essentially there's been a lot of work about identifying the different stages, and talk of, for example, having ways of ensuring that innovations that move from one stage to the next stage have met the right criteria for moving on, what they call stage gates. I'll just give an example of a typical innovation process. It doesn't really matter about the detail here. You've probably come across Kotler. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Lucky you. But Kotler's this is just one example of a series of stages of the innovation process: idea generation, idea screening, blah, 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 right through to eventual commercialization. Okay? And the literature has really focused on what I would call a project management perspective, i.e., how can we rationalize this process? How can we create a set of management tools to ensure that we can take the innovation through this process in a very rigid and organized way? Now, there's a lot of value in this, but for me, it's only half the picture, okay? And what we've seen in the NPD process, NPD, New Product Development, or the New Service, NSD literature, is an attempt to try and get the most sophisticated model there is. And I've been to companies that seem to think that the more sophisticated, the more boxes and the more arrows they have in their diagram, the more likely it is they'll end up with a successful innovation. So the emphasis here is on project management, trying to rationalize how we select projects, how we rationalize the allocation of resources, how we rationalize and manage the movement from one stage to another stage, like stage gates. Once we've screened our idea, how do we take it to the next stage? Anyone who works in an organization knows this is not really how ideas develop. And we can all post-rationalize the way in which products are developed, but actually this is very problematic in a way, because this is about reducing creativity rather than embracing creativity. So there's quite a tension here. One can understand why you want an innovation process, because innovations, particularly in certain sectors like the pharmaceutical sector or the automobile sector, innovation can cost huge amounts of money. So you've got to get it right. However, there's no point getting a product that works but is not innovative. Okay, so one has to get attention. There's this tension, this paradox between being innovative and being innovative so that you're efficient in doing that. Okay, so this is a particular approach to understanding innovation. However, from your experience and from my experience, and if you look at cases of innovation, we can see that there are a number of problems with this approach. So although the literature is telling managers, it's telling MBAs, it's telling everyone to focus on project management, there are a number of problems. One is these models, which you call stage models because they're a series of stages you have to go through to create new products and services, overemphasize rationality. Okay? Innovation is actually a very iterative process, a bit like when you're doing your dissertation. You have to go through a whole series of stages where you get to a certain point and you might think, actually, you have to start again. Or, for example, you get to a certain stage where you've produced a prototype, you take it to a customer, and the customer says, well, that doesn't really work for me, and you have to go back a few stages. So an innovation process isn't simply going steps 1, 2, 3, 4, launching a product. It is actually very complex, it's very messy, it's often non-linear, it often has feedback loops. So these two, for me, are an issue. The other thing is you see major variations between different sectors. So one of the things that you always have to bear in mind, and I'm sure you do, is that when we have models, we have to think about how those models, or if those models, fit the sector and context we're in. And you can see that actually there's a wide variation between the new product or new service development process for a finance service or product compared to a pharmaceutical good or compared to a fast-moving consumer good. These processes are very different. However, for me, far more important than that is actually innovation isn't just about project management. Innovation is a social, political, and emotional process. And I want to say a little bit about the social, political, and emotional process and why I think that. These are some of the reasons why I think we have to think about innovation being a social process rather than simply managing a set of stages. Okay? Innovation is about, well, if we think about the raw material of innovation, we're thinking about knowledge. We're thinking about ideas. And knowledge actually doesn't reside in books. That's information. Knowledge resides in here. In fact, you could argue we should be talking about knowing, not knowledge. And knowing only reveals itself when we do things, when we talk, when we communicate. One of the reasons I think one-to-one dissertation sessions are very useful is actually neither of us know the answer until we've discussed it. And what pops it out is something from a process. So you could argue that knowledge isn't in here. Knowledge is the outcome of a process. And a process is a social process about interaction. The other thing worth saying is that when we're talking about the raw material or the ingredients of innovation, we're talking quite often about tacit knowledge. Now, tacit knowledge is knowledge that is difficult to articulate. So, for example, how you drive a car, how do you ride a bicycle? Now, I'm sure you can buy books on how to drive a car, and I'm sure books will tell you about the biting point if you on the gear. If you use the, do you use the gears, or do you use automatics? Yeah. If you're using gears, you have the biting point, and you only know what that biting point is when you should let the handbrake off, by experience. Many things that we do are, in terms of cooking, in terms of riding a bicycle, are really, how do we know when the liquid well, if we're whisking cream, how do we know when that texture is just right? It's experience, and it's actually very difficult to write down what that is. Okay, so knowledge is split in very, very crudely. There's a whole literature about this, but you could split knowledge into the difference between tacit and explicit. Explicit is knowledge that's written down, or can be written down. So knowledge has dimensions of it which are, as I say, you could even call explicit knowledge not knowledge at all, but simply information. Because if it can be written down, then it's not really knowledge. But nevertheless, there are things about knowledge and that are difficult to articulate, and therefore it requires us to interact socially. The other thing that's worth knowing is that knowledge doesn't reside in individuals. I might think I know it all, but I don't. And we all might think that. But actually, increasingly, knowledge doesn't reside within one individual, it's distributed. And it's not distributed just within one organisation, it's distributed amongst countries, amongst different organisations, amongst different sectors. So if knowledge is distributed, and we need those different bits of knowledge to put together to come up with a new innovation, then we need to find ways of getting that knowledge, and that knowledge is often through, it can be using technology, internet for example, but it could also, and often is through social networks. I won't go through all of these, but what I'm saying is here is that there's a whole series of elements of to do with knowledge and information and the development of innovation that actually require a social dimension, an understanding of the social dimension. These aren't simply about determining what the different stages are and managing the project through. That kind of takes the human out of the process. And what I'm saying here is we need to put the human back in the process because the human is the important component. If we extend the social, we end up actually thinking about innovation being a political process. And it's a political process because any innovation project is going to, or an idea, is often competing with another idea to be selected. Because I don't think there's a single organisation that doesn't have limited resources. And if there's limited resources and lots of ideas, you have to select between those ideas in relation to developing a project or an innovation. And what you find in organisations is that although there are all sorts of techniques which exist in textbooks and exist in organisations for evaluating ideas and selecting those ideas in a rational way, quite often ideas get selected because individuals have got support from other individuals and people coalesce around ideas, i.e. they come together around ideas. So what you often find is in organisations, the notion that selecting the best idea is not what actually happens. It's which idea is championed by the most people or by the most senior people. So again, I'm not saying that rational criteria are never used, but one has to be careful thinking that this is the only way that ideas or decisions get made in organisations. The selection of ideas can be about the championing of ideas by individuals, which can be a political process with a small p. I don't mean party political. As I've said earlier, that innovation, ideas, knowledge, information is distributed. Well, if it's distributed, then we need to share it. The question is, why do we share? Why should we share? We should never assume that people are willing to share knowledge, because actually, and there's a very famous book called The Knowledge Creating Organisation or something, by Nanaka, who's the main author, and Japanese author. And he talks basically about the transfer of knowledge within organisations. I won't go into the details. But the assumption he makes is that effectively we can get, if we share knowledge, we can go into a spiral of knowledge, and because knowledge plus knowledge equals new knowledge. But the assumption there is that we are willing to share. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Nanaka is Japanese. He's written that from the cultural context of a society that it has a much more collectivist view of the world than, for example, the British or the Americans. I'm not so sure you can tell me about the Caribbean or the Canadian. But if you were to believe Hofstadter, and have you done Hofstadter? I mean, there's a lot of problems with Hofstadter's work, but, and if we are, again, to believe the stereotypes that he creates, the Japanese are far more collectivist than the English. So one might assume that the Japanese are more willing to share knowledge because the collective is seen as an important thing. In England, the individual is seen as a more important unit of analysis because people are more individualistic. And again, these are stereotypes, but this is the way it's research seems to suggest. In an individualistic society, you say, knowledge is power, why should I share? I will share with you if you tell me something. So what you end up with is a more trading approach. And what you see is the sharing of knowledge is about